Why were medieval swords so broad? Well, the first thing to say is that not all medieval swords were broad, but I think it's fair to say that in the grand scheme of things, when we look at swords from all different periods and all over the world, that medieval swords are generally tending towards being on the broader end of the spectrum. And there are many reasons for that. And I've broken those down for this video into 5 reasons why medieval swords tended to be broader than other types of sword we look at. So first up, what period am I actually talking about? Well, the early medieval period, sometimes known as the Migration era, which led into the so-called Viking Age, would be using swords like this. We're generally talking about what you at Oakshott would have called Type 10 blades. Not all of them had fullers, although certainly by the Viking period most of them had fullers. In the earlier Migration era, so after the fall of the Roman Empire, we find that quite a lot of blades, in fact, are more without fullers and with different blade sections to this. Sometimes they have double fullers even, actually. But generally speaking, they are broad blades. And then at the end of our period, we're talking about the 15th century, when we start to see blades which look a little bit more like this. Ignore the fact that this is a two-handed sword, or at least a two-handed grip. And the other one is a one-handed grip. That's more or less irrelevant. We find all types of blade types with both longer grips and shorter grips in the 15th century. So just concentrate on the blades here. And these tapering types of blades, whilst they are very dominant in the 14th and 15th centuries, aren't the only types of blades we find them. We do indeed find blades which are broader towards the tip as well, and that's ignoring things like falchions and other sorts of specialised swords. If we just look at normal swords, be they long swords or one-handed swords, then we do find some that are broader towards the tip and some that are narrower towards the tip. In the earlier period, they do predominantly, well, pretty much always actually, have this type of broad blade. So why would that be? So I think it's fair to say that the dominant reason why we find broad blades, certainly in the earlier period, and indeed you could say when these broader blades are used in the later parts of the Middle Ages as well, is to do with cutting power. There is no question that having more inertia towards the end of your blade adds to your cutting power. And you'll notice that these blades have a lot of distal taper, so they start off thicker at the base of the blade and get thinner along, such that when you flex them, they flex more towards the tip of the blade than they do at the base of the blade. I'm doing this carefully, incidentally, because this is a sharp blade that I do test cut with. Both these swords I'm using in this video are by Albion, incidentally. Yeah, so these broader blades cut better for a number of reasons. I'm not going to go into that because that's a whole video by itself, but generally speaking, more inertia towards the tip, it aids edge alignment and gives authority to the cut. So we can say the number one reason why your blade might be broad, certainly if it's broad up here, is to add cutting power. But when we look at the later period swords, like these, you will notice that the portion of the blade you're actually cutting with is from about here, let's say about there, upwards. And actually the blade isn't especially broad there and certainly above that. In fact, if we look at later periods of swords, like sabres, backswords, basket-hilted broadswords, things like this, even katanas, then indeed the blades are not, this is no broader than those are up here. So we can't necessarily say that broadness of blade, because this is very broad at the base of the blade still, is necessarily the reason why medieval swords were broad here. Cutting power doesn't seem to have any benefit from being broad down there. Okay, so number one reason why a blade might be broad is cutting power, but that's not the only, or even sometimes that's not even a reason why a blade might be broad at the base. So aside from cutting power, the second reason why I think that blades may be broad, and certainly when they're broad at the base of the blade, or indeed broad all the way along, like this, is for material science. So as I've mentioned in a couple of recent videos that I've done, to mixed reactions, we have to accept that medieval steel, on average, was not as good or as reliable or consistent as modern steel is. And indeed, there were other parts of the world where they were making better quality steel. For example, in India, parts of the Middle East some of the time, and in Japan and China as well, a lot of the time as well. I mean, obviously there's a difference between whether we're talking about high status or medium or low status swords. So there were always better quality examples and worse quality examples. But something we have to accept is that in medieval Europe, they were using bloomery steel, which contained a lot of slag inclusions. That is, that the steel wasn't homogeneous and it had a lot of inclusions of slag material from the production of the steel itself that incorporated inherent weaknesses in the fabric of the blade. Therefore, if you take something like a rapier or a small sword blade, a very narrow blade, if you tried to make one of those blades out of medieval steel with the usual amount of slag you find in most medieval blades, then you would end up with a very inconsistent product which would break more often than if you were using a modern steel and modern heat treatment. So we can say that possibly, and this is conjecture, but possibly one reason that medieval blades stayed fairly broad compared to all the other swords in the world is that they didn't fully trust the steel of their blades within the context that they were using them in. And remember, of course, that they were using them in a time of armour and against many different types of weapons, with shields usually, certainly until about the late 14th century. And so within that context, I think it's fair to say that they may have overbuilt their blades to compensate for the unreliability of the material that they were using. Number 3 reason is a reason that is more applied to these tapering blades. So one question I've often asked, and other people have asked as well, is if your blade is that broad here, why do you need it to be any broader here? Because all of your cutting power really is dictated by the breadth of the blade at this point, which is no broader than an 18th or 19th century military sword. So why have a blade that is so broad at the base? Well, as I've mentioned, clearly with the earlier period swords that are broad all the way along, well, they're broad at the base because they're also broad up here, and that's to do primarily probably with cutting power. But when you've got a sword that isn't that broad up here, why is it that broad down here? And something that people who practice HEMA, or historical European martial arts, in other words historical fencing, often refer to is the feel and balance and heft of the weapon. And I think there's definitely, that's probably got an element of truth to it. And that probably is one reason why in the medieval period blades did often get broader up here. But I'll just reiterate, not all did. Some longswords are as broad at the base here as they are at the cutting portion here. So not all swords get broader here. And using Oakeshot's typology, 2 of the most common types, as he labelled them, of blades that are very broad at the base and taper down are the Type 15 and the Type 18. We could also look at Type 14 and Type 16 as well, and other types that are that. But why might you want a blade that's broader here? Remember that when you make it broader here, you're adding mass, you're making the blade heavier. So why would you do that? Well, one possible reason is this answer of kind of balance and the way that the sword feels and moves in your hand. So if you have more mass back towards the hand here, the sword moves in a more pleasing way. And many people point out that pommels, many pommels, and I've pointed this out for many years, are historically actually hollow. They're not necessarily always a solid lump. And actually a pommel has far less effect on the balance of the overall sword than many people think. Many people think of this purely as a counterbalance, but it's not only that. In fact, if you take the pommel off a sword, you'll often find that with this type of tapered blade, they often feel quite good in the hand already before you add a hilt on. So we're getting a lot of the physical characteristics of how that sword moves as a lever, how it feels in the hand and how it tracks through the air. We're getting a lot of that purely from the shape and form of the blade. We could view the pommel as fine-tuning that. The crossguard has very little effect apart from on overall weight. So it's possible that these tapered blades remain broad at the base of the blade because they liked the way that that felt in the hand and that it somehow improved the movement and balance of the sword in the hand. But just to reiterate once more, not all medieval swords get broader at the base. Some of them are narrower at the base. So that clearly wasn't a universal feature for having a broad blade at the base. So we still, in a way, are asking the question, why did these tapered blades exist? And we have to look to the other points in this list. Let's move on to the next point. Right, the fourth point I want to list is related to something I touched on previously, and that is to do with the context in which they were fighting. We have to remember that during the medieval era, these swords were backup weapons. They were usually secondary weapons, and the primary weapons were usually things like spears, lances on horseback, of course, pole axes, maces, things like this. The sword is a sidearm, ergo it's worn at the side. It's a big knife you can carry around anywhere with you, but it's not usually a primary weapon, or at least not intended to be. But you have to therefore remember that when a sword is used, it's often not going to be used against another sword. Very often if a person's using a sword, they're going to be using it against a lance, a spear, a bill, a halberd, a poleaxe, things like this. So therefore, a medieval sword, perhaps unlike, for example, 19th century swords, which have to only face bayonets or other swords, a medieval sword has to be able to face all other types of weapons. It has to be strong enough to face pole arms and maces and axes and things like this, war hammers. So we could say that perhaps this is to do with strength in terms of not just the material, which I've spoken about already, but also the fact that we're striking against armour, we're striking against shields, intentionally or unintentionally. Even if you're aiming for the gaps between the armour, or bits of unarmoured on a person, the bits that aren't covered by armour, you're still sometimes going to hit armour. You're still, whether you mean to or not, you're going to hit helmets, you're going to hit shields and bucklers and things like this. So maybe these blades that stayed broad at the base partly did so because of the context of the fighting that happened at that time. It was a very rough test for a sword that was encountering polearms and armour and shields, when in later periods, and perhaps in other parts of the world, they wouldn't necessarily encounter such hardcore opposition. Additionally, within that context, it's not only about the survivability of the sword, but it's about the ability of the sword to actually oppose those heavy objects in combat. And if someone's swinging a poleaxe at you, do you want to have a weapon which has some added mass down here? Or do you want to have something that's more like a 19th century sabre, which is the same width at the base as it is at the cutting portion? You could indeed obviously have a lighter, quicker sword if it stayed the same breadth at the cutting portion of the blade and all the way down to the base. But that being a lighter weapon, it would make it more difficult to oppose heavier strikes from heavier weapons. So it's possible that in addition to the strength and survivability of the weapon, they were also concerned with having a bit of mass in your hand that would make it a little bit easier to oppose heavy weapons like polearms. And the fifth and final reason is one that I don't think I've seen other people explicitly mention, at least not for a while, but something that I think is actually quite important and an advantage of blades which are broad at the base, and that is hand protection. Now, you will see on a medieval sword, we do not have much hand protection. Additional hand protection is something that comes in later towards the end of the 15th century and into the 16th century, with side rings and various other things. We do see hints of those. We do see finger rings kind of in the end of the 14th, beginning of the 15th century. We start to see side rings at the end of the 15th century. But by and large, most swords in the medieval period have very little in the way of hand protection. Obviously, in the earlier period, we've got almost no hand protection, but that's not really important because we're using a large shield. Okay, so if we ignore this point, it doesn't really apply to these early swords. Because the shield and the line to your hand or the line to your sword arm is protected by the fact that you're holding a shield on one side of your body, or at least in front of the sword arm. In the later periods, when a sword is more likely to be used by itself, so after the widespread abandonment of shields for a lot of people, where this is just a sidearm and a backup weapon, so they're not going to be carrying a shield, or if they are, it's just a buckler. Hand protection is minimal, and in that context, if the blade is very broad at the base, if you look at the line that a person's blade will come down, if it comes down here and hits my guard, you will notice, if I just borrow the earlier period sword for a minute very carefully, because obviously it's sharp, the broader the blade is, the further it is away from your hand. So the broad base of the blade becomes a sort of shield, and in fact if we look at fencing swords, so-called Federschwerts as we call them now, sometimes Paratschwert, if we look at those, they retain a very broad base at the blade, and it's very likely that that was partially or perhaps even entirely for additional hand protection. So having a broad base of the blade without adding anything to the crossguard and without really changing the design of the sword very much gives us an added element of hand protection that we didn't have otherwise. If that blade was narrower down here, it would be far easier for blades which are coming sliding down to hit parts of my hand, either on the outside or the inside. So I think a possible, and this is completely theory, this is not proven at all, but it is proven by my own experience of nearly 20 years of using these sorts of swords in training. Broader blades at the base do provide more hand protection. So there we go. Those are what I think are the 5 dominant reasons why medieval swords were broad, aka broadswords, as popular literature sometimes refers to them. And remember that they were broad for different reasons, or in a different balance of reasons, and broad in different ways. Whilst late medieval swords are often broad at the base, unless they're a specialised sword like a falchion, they're usually not that broad up here, although there was a comeback towards the end of the era towards these broad blades at the tip. And I think if we've got a sword that's broad towards the tip, we're looking at primarily to do with cutting power. If we're looking at a sword that is not broad at the tip but is broad at the base, then we have to ask ourselves other reasons why that might be. I hope that's been interesting, and see you again soon for a new video. Click subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers folks! Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers folks!